Hello, and welcome to the Delphi Insight session. Let's get started. It's so exciting to have everyone here for our monthly Insight session. And today we are so fortunate to have with us Kate Reynolds. Kate is the Director of Research at Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety with a background in public health and pharmacoepidemiology. And she has a strong track record in medication safety and surveillance. Kate has led national projects ranging from cough and cold medicine safety to antivenom effectiveness and pediatric overdose prevention. For the past 3 years, Kate has been pioneering psychedelic data collection initiatives to ensure these treatments are studied and understood in real-world settings. Her presentation today, Understanding Real-World Psychedelic Use, Insights from a Comprehensive National Survey, introduces the first large-scale tool tracking psychedelic use across the U.S. This work provides the kind of data such as state-level prevalence, use motivations, and mental health profiles that can directly inform policy, clinical trials, and product development in this rapidly evolving field. In just a moment, we're going to welcome Kate together. I just want to take a pause to say this kind of work is the unseen work that creates the bedrock for especially an emerging field that has such consumer protection concerns that psychedelics do. So you need this type of data collection and analysis to create that bedrock and that safety net so that we can build on that and move forward and not slide back. And so we're so grateful to Kate and everyone at Rocky Mountain who is doing this work, and very excited to hear her presentation today and to receive your questions from the audience afterwards. So Kate, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and for giving us the opportunity to be part of this series. As Leah mentioned, I'm Kate Reynolds, Director of Research here at Rocky Mountain, and I'll be talking about one of our data collection tools, which is coincidentally called NSIHT in this Insight series, and I'll explain more about that, what that means as we go. Before we really dive in, I do just want to take a moment to recognize and honor one of my colleagues, Dr. Carrie Rockhill. Carrie is one of our tremendous thought leaders and really the brainchild behind the data we'll be sharing today. And she also helped create the original version of this presentation. She couldn't be here today because she just had a baby, but I wanted to make sure that we recognized her and gave her credit for this work, and hopefully I can do her work justice in this presentation. I will also point out that portions of the work presented here today were funded by a grant from SAMHSA, and our organization receives funding from an array of funding agencies, including federal and industry contracts. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Rocky Mountain before we dive into the data collection tool. We're a unique organization, mission-driven, and operate as a division of Denver Health and Hospital Authority, which is the large safety net hospital operating here in the city and county of Denver. Though we're part of a hospital system, Rocky Mountain really is specialized part of the organization that leads the monitoring of safety and effectiveness of drugs in the real world. And we've been doing this work for more than 20 years. We support this kind of core mission through a number of different services, which include a poison helpline. We were actually founded as a poison center in 1956 and have many of our philosophy still is oriented in that sort of public safety, public benefits. We also have medical information services and pharmacovigilance services, which support the safe use of medications. And then my team really leads the epidemiological use research and public health surveillance. Our research division, which is the team I lead, has published more than 150 papers on the impact of drug use. And I'm really fortunate to have this amazing team of clinicians, scientists, and program leaders really leading this work. So I mentioned that we have been monitoring drug safety and effectiveness for more than 20 years, but psychedelic research poses new challenges and opportunities for us. I've called out a few here just to anchor us. As we know, there are decades and even centuries of use of psychedelics with longstanding cultural and historical context and meanings surrounding use that we may not even really fully understand today. This has led, in some instances, to stigma and bias, which makes doing this research difficult at times. Use, of course, is not uniform. There are many different forms of use, including recreational, therapeutic, spiritual, underground, and so forth. And again, maybe we don't even really understand all of those contexts yet. All of this really leads to a major data gap. And that is because most systems that exist today are really not well equipped to measure this complexity. They were not designed for these specific purposes and are being leveraged to address questions as quickly as possible. Though the field is definitely evolving quickly and new tools are being developed every day. So thinking about these challenges, we set out to design fit-for-purpose data collection tools to understand psychedelic use. And this diagram is meant to help us visualize the data collection approach. On the left side of the diagram, we have the data collection tools that we have been operating for several decades around substance use. Each sort of little sliver of the pie represents a different outcome or tool that we use. We put together these data sources in a mosaic approach, which really just means putting multiple systems together to create a more complete picture of what you are studying. An example of this might be if you're interested in understanding severe harms from a specific prescription drug, you might look at both death certificate data as well as the rate of treatment for misuse of that substance to really understand the sort of end of the spectrum of risky use. On the right side, we have our new psychedelic tools. They include the bottom sort of piece of the pie there, our enhanced poison center data system, which is really designed to capture the maximum amount of context around acute health effects reported to poison centers. We measure therapeutic use by monitoring patients in a longitudinal format, either in states or prescription forms. We have a ketamine pilot right now, which we intend to expand to other prescription forms when those become available. And then the sort of middle pie there is our population survey methodology, which includes two different tools. One of them is our NSIHT tool, which we will be spending the majority of our time talking about today. So I still haven't told you what NSIHT stands for. So here it is. NSIHT is the National Survey Investigating Hallucinogenic Trends. I'm going to be spending the rest of my time here today walking you through the development methodology that we put behind this tool and sharing some data just to demonstrate that we really are building the largest and most rigorous ongoing survey of adult psychedelic use in the US. A little bit about the development. We followed an extensive process informed by a lot of the work that we have done historically, which started with doing focus groups. And this helped us validate the tools we were developing, but also understand the different contexts of experience with a group of diverse individuals with lived psychedelic experience. This qualitative work has really helped ground our research and is the cornerstone of the quality roadmap that we've laid out. We then piloted the tool, which included testing the survey and its length and modifying the questions after a soft and hard launch. We also performed a thorough content validity process, which involved asking people the same questions in multiple different ways to test their comprehension and asking participants to tell us what they thought the question meant to ensure that the question we intended to ask is the question that the respondent thought they were answering. And we also did a similar process where we tested and retested reliability of responses. So essentially, we would ask them a question on one survey, and then doing a follow-up survey, we would ask another very similar question to see how similar their responses were. And our kind of final key milestone here on the development roadmap is doing external comparisons. And this is really important in understanding how valid your measurements and estimates are. We have done comparisons to the NSIHT tool as well as the RAND survey and some others. I don't have the results from all of this work. This will all be included in publications that will be available hopefully as early as this year. We have submitted several of them, hope to have them published before the end of the year. And this part is really important in terms of enhancing the rigor of our tool, going through that peer review process and making our methods as transparent as possible. Okay, so now I want to move into a little bit more specifics on how we do this. And though it might seem really straightforward, one of the most important design questions we had to address was how to get to psychedelic users. With recruitment, you have to be really cautious not to introduce bias. If you go out looking for specific types of users, especially psychedelic users, you may find people who are biased in one direction or another. And a lot of the kind of current surveys have faced this issue right now. We mitigate this bias by recruiting from a commercial survey panel company. So the way this works is people sign up to be a member of a survey panel which it really is agnostic to certain behaviors. These people may take surveys on their TV watching preferences. I looked at our vendor's website yesterday and they had presidential approval rating on there and also travel preferences. We then use this same approach with the commercial survey panel company to get to people who use substances. To further avoid the bias of surveying only psychedelic users, we capture both users and non-users and everything in between to really have the sort of broadest set of contexts. And then we strategically oversample on psychedelic use. The puzzle diagram to the right is really meant to convey that. So we target a large, nationally representative population and then oversample psychedelic use. We link those data together and we combine those data sets to create this sort of enriched psychedelic data sets. This is actually a fairly elaborate statistical process, and we have a pending publication on this as well. Later on in the presentation, I'll be sharing with how you can contact us and how you can sign up to be part of the distribution list that receives information about these publications when they're available. This is just a quick slide to reiterate that we're intending to capture the sort of broad spectrum of use, not interested in any single population's perspective, but really what is the landscape of the landscape of the use in the US. And these dots in this sort of chart convey that with everything from enthusiasts to naysayers and single use to frequent use. Okay, moving on to the specific substances that we capture. We actually have the most rigorous set of psychedelic substances being studied in a survey of this type. This includes natural fungi and plant derivatives, psychedelics with stimulant and hallucinogenic properties, DMT, LSD, and we also include ketamine and esketamine. And that's important to us specifically because as we think about pharmaceutical forms, they are going to be used in similar patient populations. So we need to understand that sort of broader population that will be affected by the availability of certain substances. And one of the kind of key features of NSIHT and most of our data collection tools is we've really designed it for accurate identification of substances. It's a construct we measured in our content validity process, and we'll continue to iterate this as we go. We have a number of different ways that we ensure accuracy, which includes using different substance names that may be slang or more standardized names, using pictures and so forth. The tool is designed to distinguish between different forms. This is not something that we have created any data on yet, but as we go forward, we'll be looking at this more closely. But we want to be able to distinguish between pharmaceutical, recreational, and state-approved forms. And we have an example here of being able to distinguish between Spravato, illicit ketamine, and prescription ketamine. And another kind of key feature is this ability to expand it. So it's not set in stone. So whatever we decide today can be modified going forward, especially as new products or sort of new contexts enter the market. Beyond building in methods to identify substances accurately, we also ensure quality by building in methodological best practices by design. I've listed some of those here. The first is calibration weighting. This is a process by which we adjust the statistical estimates based on how our sample differs from what we know about the national population. This allows us to say that 5% of US adults use this substance versus saying 5% of the people who took this survey use the substance. And that's really important when you're thinking about trying to understand the national population. We've built in careless response, which is another method that helps us remove people who are not answering the questions thoughtfully. We look for certain patterns of responses and then either exclude that survey altogether or exclude certain questions from our sample. For example, if someone always selects option C, we can exclude those data. We have interleading questions, which essentially mixes up questions so that there's fresh content being reviewed by the respondents consistently. This is a way to just really make sure that people don't experience fatigue when they're reviewing a long list of related questions. We have the adaptive questions, which is also commonly referred to as skip logic. This helps us control the length of the interview and limit fatigue. For example, if you've never taken psilocybin, we won't ask you questions about your psilocybin use. We have randomization, which is another kind of key feature that distinguishes our tool. So we scramble the questions. Each person gets a different set, and that way questions that occur at the end of the survey don't experience a greater degree of fatigue. And then finally, one of the true advantages of this type of data collection approach is that we can generate a large sample size quickly. This lets us measure rare behaviors, but it also just really creates a lot of statistical rigor in our data. And as I mentioned, we include all of these in our insight tool. Okay, one last background slide, which is just to bring life what we were really able to measure. So beyond prevalence, which is one of the key measures and the patterns of use around prevalence, we also look at reasons so we can understand motivations for use, the set and setting, really to explore context and its influence, understand the source of acquisition, which of course can affect both risk and benefits, which is another thing we measure, perceived risk and benefits, and have a number of different validated scales to help us measure these things accurately. And then we can track concomitant use and really, again, trying to understand the full context of use and how that may affect risk and benefit. And then lastly, the tool is flexible. I've touched on this a few points, but we're able to modify and include questions around special topics. Some of the things we have planned are around prep work, integration, and microdosing, and that's going to continue to evolve as we learn more. We can rotate content in, which allows that ability to address emerging topics or to pilot certain questions. This can be really helpful for researchers who are interested in going after grant funding. We can help them pilot certain questions, get pilot data. And then finally, we offer sponsored content. So if a stakeholder is interested in understanding specific questions, we can generate that data by creating space in our standard tool. All right, we'll move on to data now. So in 2024, we had 2 survey launches. Each survey had over 2,000 psychedelic respondents for a total sample of 4,329 psychedelic surveys out of a total of 57,000 total surveys. The psychedelic sample itself was quite diverse. We had 100% of states covered and Washington, D.C. Interestingly, we had every psychedelic covered, and about 50% of the sample was using 2 or more psychedelics, and the other 50% was just using one psychedelic. The sample's fairly diverse. 29% of respondents were non-white race. And we are also able to get to certain special populations of interest. And in this case, 22% of our sample were either veterans or first responders. All right. Now really into the data. This slide shows us prevalence of use by certain non-pharmaceutical and psychedelic substances. The top bar there is cannabis. And not surprisingly, it has the highest prevalence of use at about 19.7%. We thought cannabis was a useful comparison, help again to contextualize psychedelics, maybe more equivalent than other illicit or prescription drugs. After cannabis, the next most common substance is any psychedelic, and that's at 4.8%. That's a combination of all the different psychedelics that we studied. Psilocybin was the highest specific psychedelic, which I don't think is very surprising at 2.1%. And that's actually higher than illicit substances like methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, and cocaine. Now looking at why people are using psychedelics, we're going to look at 4 different drugs as an example. We can do this across all of our different psychedelics studied. When we look at psilocybin, the majority are for fun. The majority of people use for fun and enjoyment at 68%. I think that's really important to keep track of as we move through these. Next, looking at prescription ketamine, not surprisingly, we see that the majority, a slight majority, are using to treat a medical condition. Again, that's not all that surprising, but fun and enjoyment still remains about 3% or that third of the sample. When we look at MDMA, we start to see this emergence of enhancements for sex, but again, recreational or fun and enjoyment use is still about 66%. And then for LSD, we actually see quite a similar pattern of a bunch of different reasons. Still fun and enjoyment is the top, but we have a number of other reasons that have pretty similar proportions of use. So what does this tell us? Really, the reasons for use do vary by psychedelic. I think this is a really important point as we continue to dive into the data that we have available, is understanding that not all psychedelics are the same and really spending time to understand what those differences are and how they may affect different outcomes or interpretations. Importantly, fun and enjoyment remains the most predominant reason across most psychedelics. And I think this is important when we think about policies that are particularly targeted toward creating kind of more controlled or even therapeutic use. And also a reminder that public perception around psychedelics is probably associated with the use of these substances for recreational purposes rather than for therapeutic reasons. And that's just something to keep in mind as these policies roll out. Okay, so now we're going to take a deeper dive into psilocybin, just as really an example of what the tool is capable of doing. So this slide shows us two different maps. One is demonstrating any psychedelic use, and the other is psilocybin use, and that's the green map here. The darker states represent the top quartile of prevalence of use. So they're not necessarily equal in terms of their prevalence, but they are in the top roughly 13 states by prevalence. So when we look at any psychedelic use, we see that there's this clustering in the West, which I think makes intuitive sense. Alaska's a little bit of an outlier. The confidence interval or the level of precision for that state's pretty broad. So I think we wouldn't think of that as particularly meaningful. When we compare any psychedelic use to psilocybin use, it's a similar set of states, again, in the West, but we start to see a little bit of an emergence of Midwest states, including Nebraska and Illinois. And I think there's just a lot more investigation to be done here to understand what those factors might be. And that's work that we'll do over time. Okay, so let's look at mental health profiles with psilocybin use. So this chart shows us lifetime diagnoses of anxiety or depressive disorder by the group using psilocybin, the group using another psychedelic, or the group not using a psychedelic. And I think what's interesting is that we see the rate of a diagnosed anxiety disorder or diagnosed depressive disorder is higher among psilocybin when we look at the group that is using another psychedelic or no psychedelic at all. Perhaps this suggests that this is a treatment-seeking population. Now, when we look at current symptoms for anxiety, which we measured using the GAD-7 tool, we see that among psilocybin users, there's a lower proportion that are experiencing moderate or severe anxiety symptoms in comparison to the proportion that have a diagnosed anxiety disorder. But when we look at the other two groups, another psychedelic and no psychedelic, that difference is not quite as prominent. It flips a little bit when we look at severe depression, which we measured using PHQ-9. So among the psilocybin group, the proportion with active moderate to severe depression symptoms is higher than the proportion with a diagnosis of depressive disorder. And that among another psychedelic group, that difference is quite large and it's fairly similar among the no psychedelic group. So why is this helpful? I think it's a good sign that we need to continue to capture both diagnosis and current symptomatology. When we think about medical treatment, we also often think about diagnosis. And the reality is that the symptoms and diagnosis may be different. I think this also means that we have to think about access based on symptoms rather than diagnosis. And the state programs, at least in Colorado and Oregon, are really designed to do this. They're really based on treatment for whatever you deem appropriate. This is also a sign that the real-world patient populations probably look a lot different from those studied in clinical trials. And I think this really warrants taking a deeper look at this psychedelic self-medication behavior and whether or not it's really truly appropriate to consider all psychedelics for these different conditions. All right, so let's look at reasons for use within the psilocybin population. So all the little people on this chart represent different parts of the population. The purple is the portion of the population that is treating medical symptoms only. So this group is really only using psilocybin for one reason. What's striking is that this is a very small portion of the total population. It's only 2.6% of all of the people who are using psilocybin. The next group is the blue group, which is those treating medical symptoms and also using for other reasons. And that's about 24.2%. But the vast majority are not using to treat medical symptoms. They're using for other reasons only. So when we look at some behaviors within these groups, this shows us the number of psychedelics used in the last year. So among the group that's treating medical symptoms, they're actually much more likely to be using more than one psychedelic than using psilocybin alone. And that difference isn't seen when we look at the group treating medical symptoms and other reasons, and the group not treating medical symptoms and only using for other reasons. So that's an interesting little pattern that we see there in that group treating medical symptoms only. And when we look at co-use or concomitant use of alcohol and cannabis, now when we look at the treating medical symptoms group, we see a much lower proportion of use with cannabis or alcohol. And just To clarify, we define concomitant use as use at the same time. That's how the question is asked in the survey. And then when we look at the group treating medical symptoms and other reasons, we see a higher proportion, and that those proportions are relatively similar among the group not treating medical symptoms. And one last characterization here. When we look at self-reported improved mental health symptoms, then the group treating medical symptoms alone, we have a high proportion agreeing or strongly agreeing that they attributed their improved mental health symptoms to psilocybin use. And that's actually even more prominent among the group treating medical symptoms and using for other reasons. But we don't see much of a difference in the group not treating medical symptoms, which would make sense. So what does this tell us? Use of psilocybin to treat medical symptoms is only a small proportion of the population. People are actually using for many other reasons, which we have now seen a couple of times in this presentation. Use of multiple psychedelics is common regardless of reason for use. And I think this is an important factor to be considering, particularly when we're thinking about research and policy. Use of cannabis is really common among those not using for medical reasons. And since this represents the largest proportion of the population, it is something to pay attention to. This could potentially be revealing problematic use, and understanding those sort of co-use behaviors and their outcomes is going to be very important. And then lastly, we saw differences in mental health improvement by the different use patterns. Okay, so tying everything we've seen together, a couple of kind of key points, which helps really stage the work that we intend to do going forward. First, use patterns are complex and are often not associated with therapeutic reasons. It's important to understand this sort of full spectrum to inform both clinical and policy approaches. Use behaviors don't exist in a silo. Specifically, medical users often use multiple substances and are commonly using for other reasons as well. This may have implications for both safety and effectiveness. These data might represent the existing market that may benefit from pharmaceutical or state-approved forms of psychedelics. And there's a lot of work that can be done with these data to help really inform some of those policy decisions, access decisions, and so forth. And finally, tools like NSIHT really help contextualize real-world conditions and in the current state, and also can serve as critical tools to monitor context. Just to reiterate a few strengths and limitations, I've covered most of the strengths. We really intended this to be the most rigorous tool available. This includes everything from substance coverage, the way we ask questions in our measurement protocols, a broad recruitment strategy, and many active tools and methods to mitigate bias. But there are limitations. This is cross-sectional, so we really should be cautious about any causal interpretations. One of the risks we run is underrepresentation of certain populations. One we are aware of is Indigenous communities. That's something that we intend to address going forward with future iterations of the survey. And fundamentally, with all survey research, self-reported data definitely introduces different types of biases. If you'd like to learn more, I would definitely encourage you to check out our public data report. This is freely available on our website. You can also contact info@RMPDS to sign up for regular NSIHT updates, or contact me directly. My information will be on the next slide. And just to highlight some of the content in the data reports, we profile each of the sort of primary psychedelics or most prevalent psychedelics just to illustrate the data that is available and the types of characterizations that we can do with these data. And then provide data that can be used right now to understand prevalence and patterns of use in the real world today. So that's it. I really want to thank everyone for their time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate. That's just fabulous presentation and fascinating information and findings. Kate, a quick question does arise. Of course, many people will be aware of the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. How does NSIHT compare to that, and how do your estimates measure up?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Leah. This is one of the assessments that will be in one of the methods publications coming out this year. I can say in general, our estimates are fairly similar. Will never be exactly the same, and that's by design. There are methods that we use that are really different than NSIHT does. NSIHT has the most robust type of recruitment that is really possible, which is why it is quite expensive to operate. Ours is much more scalable. But with that comes some trade-offs in the type of data that you're able to capture. We also capture more psychedelic respondents. I believe NSIHT is capturing about 2,000 psychedelic users a year, and we're getting closer to 4,000 with this intention to continue to scale that up. And there's a number of other different sort of differences, including that we have a more rigorous set of psychedelics studied. I don't remember, I think there's 11 in NSIHT, and some data like Psilocybin, which does seem like a major gap, only provides lifetime use, so not more recent use like past year use.
Awesome. So much more specialized, much more focused, and actually larger sample size.
Yep. They're doing different things for sure. This is critical, and hopefully funding for that tool will continue. There have been some challenges as it relates to that, but they're serving different purposes. And I think they're both essential to really addressing these questions.
Just a follow-on question to that, in the areas where the government survey, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, maybe is not really capturing the right story or the actual story, not in a competitive way, but in a analytical way. How does NSIHT help to maybe shore up our understanding of those numbers?
Yeah, this is a great question too, and thank you for asking it, because I think it's a really good question to help connect those dots. I think both NSIHT and NSIHT provide these anchoring data to really understand at the highest level what is the rate of use of these different substances, right? And we can compare NSIHT to NSIHT to feel confident about those measures. But then what NSIHT is designed to do is really to provide a lot more context than that, to ask questions about behaviors, about co-use, about patterns, and to really modify or to monitor those changes over time, because the environment is changing so quickly. And NSIHT really isn't designed to do that. It's designed to provide those sort of prevalence level estimates, to provide some basic demographics, which is critical in this as well. But NSIHT's really designed to go much deeper and to continue to evolve and grow with the ecosystem.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have 3 questions from the audience. I'm going to go in order here. The first question, can you please say more about how this data differs from clinical trial data?
Yes, wonderful question. So clinical trials are really designed with a specific research question in mind. They want to be able to understand how different outcomes will change based on controlled variables. So with that comes the exclusion of a lot of let's say, diversity in the people who are included in clinical trials. That can be their race or ethnicity, but can also be in terms of their medical conditions. We know many of the psychedelic clinical trials exclude people with medical conditions that may make it very difficult to detect an outcome. And that's important when we're thinking about measuring the effect of a drug. Where the NSIHT data becomes valuable, and other tools like this measuring real world use, is we can contextualize what's happening today. And the reality is that we are not going to be able to roll out these drugs either in states or in the pharmaceutical context and prohibit use for all these people with contraindications. And when we think about the decriminalized space or the underground space, we know that those types of interactions are already happening, right? People are already using them. And even though a clinical trial may have contraindicated the use of that in a certain population. And so I think that sort of gives us 2 things. It gives us a way to understand the impact at a population level. There's a lot of data that exists out there right now that we can start to understand what does that risk look like in these populations that haven't been studied in clinical trials.
Great. Awesome answer. Thank you so much. This next question is from Will Lucas, who's a well-known researcher in the field. Kate, thank you for the presentation. Did your survey differentiate between the mental health diagnoses or symptoms outside of depression and anxiety? Did you capture data specific to the state-regulated model?
Yeah, so 2 questions there. The first is mental health diagnoses outside of anxiety and depression. And we do have several conditions. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but other mental health conditions as well. And I believe some of those data are available in the public data report if you're interested in learning more, and will be part of some of the profiling data that we do going forward. And then the second question was on distinguishing between states and state forms and maybe other forms. And we have the ability to do that. We haven't analyzed those data yet. One of the questions I think we all have within my team are relatively rare in the grand scheme of psychedelic use. How precise will the insight tool be in capturing the context around the state forms present day? And do we need to oversample people who are using state approved forms and that kind of thing in order to be able to really provide reliable estimates? And that's work we'll have to do over the coming years. And maybe as other states start to create programs like this, we may be able to create a level of precision that may or may not exist today. We just don't know.
Awesome. Great. And the third question, they're asking, what was the most surprising finding from the first year of data? And the question here is maybe most surprising for you personally, or more most surprising for Rocky Mountain in general?
Ooh, the Rocky, it's a big bucket. I'll answer the personal question and I'll see where that goes. But one thing I didn't share today, our first publication using these data was actually a paper around tourism. And I think when we sought out to write that paper, we were just really interested in this pattern. People are traveling just like they did for cannabis. When Colorado legalized cannabis, we had this influx of folks coming from out of state and these sort of tourism focused programs to bring people in. And so we're just kind of curious what we could learn if we looked at NSIHT. And I think we saw a lot of travel to Oregon and Colorado, primarily Colorado. It was the top destination in the US. And what we actually saw was the people who travel, they tend to have higher rates of mental illness. They are more likely to travel for use in some type of facilitated context. And they tend to have this greater need for support. And so I think what that told us is that, one, there's likely to be great demand for these state programs, and that being in Colorado, we are already helping Coloradans and potentially our neighboring states and others with unmet medical needs. And so I think that was something that was exciting to see and an area we want to continue to monitor as we go forward.
Great. And I just want to mention how that potentially ties to access in the future. So as these numbers come through and we start to see that the need is there and the demand is there and people want to access these programs, the ability to reduce costs for that access to happen, I'm hopeful about that. And I know that there are good folks in the field who are working on payment solutions around that. And I just feel like this weaves together really well to support that potential for greater access. Wonderful. Looks like no further questions. We're ending right on time today. And Kate, I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of the field for all of your awesome and innovative work in this space and for your team there at Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Services. Much gratitude. We're so excited for the work that you're doing and what will come in the future.
Thanks so much, Leah. Appreciate your time.
To be here. Okay. And thank you, audience. Look forward to seeing you next month on November 5th for our next Insight session. Hope you have a great month. Bye-bye.